And welcome to the first of our 2 online sessions for the 7th Annual Summit on Nevada Education. I'm Nancy Weaver, the Director of Communications for the College of Education here at UNLV, and I'm so happy that so many of you were able to join us today. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our speaker this afternoon, Ms. Juliana Urtubey, who is our 2021 National and Nevada Teacher of the Year. She is National Board Certified Teacher with a bachelor's degree in bilingual elementary education and a master's degree in special bilingual education from the University of Arizona. She's in her 7th year of teaching at Kermit Booker Innovative Elementary School in Las Vegas. And today she joins us to share strategies to build inclusive environments in our schools that meet students where they are in their academic, social, and emotional development, strengthen student-teacher bonds, and facilitate student confidence through individualized support. So please help me welcome Juliana Urtubey.
It is so nice to be here with you all. I hope some of you were able to join us for lunch and that we're just reconnecting today. I'm going to go ahead and say the magic words of our last couple of years, which is allow me to share my screen. There we go. All right. And I have my camera set so that I can see everybody in the chat box. And I think that that's going to be one of the ways that we can engage. I know that this is a smaller group. Please feel free to jump in on the chat box. All right, here we go. So yes, my name is Juliana Urtubey, and I'm so incredibly proud to be the 2021 National Teacher of the Year. Never in a million years did I think that this is where I would be standing today. And it's honestly because of my community that I've learned so much from, that I feel empowered enough to tour the country and represent teachers everywhere. I know what a difficult couple of years this has been for teachers, and particularly for special education teachers. We've had new curves along the way, and I'm so happy to have the opportunity for us to be here so that we can connect, so that we can support each other and hopefully reinvigorate a little bit of the energy. I know that November gets a little bit tough. So yes, I have been a resource and inclusion teacher for a very long time. I am so proud to be a special education teacher. I believe that I'm the 3rd special education teacher to hold the title of National Teacher of the Year. And so it gives me a lot of joy, and it fuels my ambition for advocacy in terms of representing students who learn and think differently. And are at the intersection of being first generation like me, English language learners, or linguistically gifted, as I like to call us. And so I started teaching in Arizona, and I came to Nevada, I believe in 2013, where I was at Crestwood Elementary for about 7 or 8 years. And I taught resource and inclusion. And I did mostly intermediate grades. And then at Booker, I transitioned over last year to Booker, where I did a co-teaching position. So I spent half my time co-teaching with our pre-K, autism, and resource settings that were all inclusion and self-contained. And then the other part of my day, I would work on whole school structures to support all students in terms of academic and behavioral interventions more than anything else. And so it's with that experience that I come to you all today to be able to talk a little bit about some of the things that I think are really important in the work that we do. But before I do that, I kind of want to know who's in the room. I want to know first, your name, if you're comfortable, your school or your educational setting. I know some of us may work for central administration or whatever it is. Let me know your space. And then one thing that you love about your students. And if you can't contain yourself to one thing, no worries. You can put in as many things as time allows. So I'll give you about a minute so that we can introduce ourselves in the chat box. And I believe if you hit everyone, we'll all be able to see. I'll start us off with a hello. Kimberly, that is so awesome. Yes. We have to stay connected because I'd love to hear more about your role. Enthusiasm, higher ed. Okay, wonderful. Oh, yes. Sarah, I feel the same way. I love making sure that my students are informing everything that we do. It's so important. Great. Okay, well, that's really helpful for me. The way I built this, because I wasn't so sure about what age ranges folks were working with. Ooh, self-contained autism at the middle school. Kids finding their voice, that's what it's all about. Wonderful. So what I'm going to do is I thought that I would share a little bit about my educational philosophy. This year, I'm spending the year advocating for a joyous and just education. It was really tough for me to narrow down my focus because, yes, I'm a special education teacher, but I also truly believe in inclusion and making sure that to the most of our ability, students are getting all of the experiences that they need to be successful, that they need to have choice and independence in their life. And so, really, I couldn't just spend this year talking about special education because we have to build just systems so that our students with learning and thinking differences are not only invited and welcomed, but are thriving in all spaces at schools. And so I love what Dina Simmons talks about how every child deserves the guarantee that they will be able to learn in the safety of who they are. And this means, particularly for our students with learning and thinking differences, that we see all of their strengths, that we know exactly who they are, and we know how to uplift them. And so for me, that's why I wanted to build a platform or a body of work for this year that would really look at the whole system and would also honor all the parts of me, right? So I'm a first generation immigrant, bilingual. And my bilingualism is really important to me because it's directly tied to who I am. I only speak to my family in Spanish. And so any threat of losing my language would put a space and a distance between my family. And that's a story that a lot of my students tell, right? And that's a story that I hope our students don't end up telling anymore, because I hope that our schools transition to places where we see our students as gifted, as gifts, and as people who have strengths. Right. My time as a special education teacher has shown me nothing else is possible but seeing that. So my students are my absolute best teachers. I love learning from them. And so what I thought we would do today is I thought we would just have more of a conversational style. I have my chat box open, so if you have something you want to contribute or a thought, go ahead. I'm a good multitasker. And so what I thought was I would take us through a couple of things that I think are really important for special educators to explore, to discuss, to tease out. And they are teacher collaboration, family collaboration, emotional and behavioral regulation, academic skills. And so what I thought was we could just kind of have a conversation about what I think some of the pillars or the important things that we need to be moving to the front of education. And with teacher collaboration, as a special ed teacher, as a resource teacher, my job was to both build instruction in a small group for the students with learning and thinking differences, and then go into their classroom and support them and support their peers and support the teacher in building inclusive environments. And it was absolutely one of the ways that I learned the most about education, about how we can't go anywhere without really collaborating with our peers. But also, I learned that this is a really tough role for special education teachers. You know, I'll be honest, there was times where some teachers didn't quite understand my role. And so they thought that I was a paraprofessional or that I was just there to like clock in some minutes for an IEP. And so I had to be a bridge builder with teachers, and it was one teacher at a time. And I had to build a reputation of a co-teacher. And so this lens of co-constructing learning for the benefit of all is something that I take to heart. And so these were some considerations that I thought about, like that helped me along the way of building collaborative spaces with teachers. The first was any opportunity I got. I mean, I'm talking about even the slightest opportunity. I knew my students' data like the back of my hand, and every chance I got, I would share and overshare information about my students' growth with their general ed teacher. So let's say that we were working on phonemic awareness, you know, like different like rhyming exercises. And I would see their teacher from across the hall and I'd scurry over and I'd be like, hello, Mr. So-and-so. Did you know that this child today did rhymes with 95% accuracy? And then I'd wait for them to respond. And if they didn't really respond too much, then I'd be like, last week they were doing this at 60% accuracy. So, wow, and I'd really celebrate the collaboration and say, thanks so much for reinforcing this skill in your classroom, or thank you so much for making it age appropriate. If it was one of the students that was a little bit older, I would really draw out the growth, the student growth. And I would make sure that the teacher and I both shared that celebration, right? Because it was because of both of us that child was making that kind of growth. In a similar way, I would use that passing time to build relationships with the other teachers. I know it's a lot extra, but I found that anything worth doing is worth doing with joy. So I found that if I built a relationship, even if it was just a professional relationship, not a personal friendship at all times, it's not always possible. But if I built a cohesive, trusting, holistic relationship with that teacher, then we could navigate the challenges much easier. So I would use passing time to just greet the teacher, find out a little bit more about who they were, their families. And in the same way that I use those informal moments to make relationships with my students' families, I would do so the same with the teachers. And I made sure that they knew, that we had collective shared goals for this child. And so I just kind of became known as like the social butterfly on campus that would just flutter everywhere. And I really wanted to be able to do that because every single classroom that I went to, even though my name wasn't on the door, was my classroom too, right? And I wanted my students to see that authenticity in collaboration because we were asking them to collaborate with their peers as well. And then the other thing is, as a special ed teacher, I got insight to a whole lot more about my students' personal lives. This is both their strengths and interests and hobbies that helped us, tailor instruction, tailor motivation, support our students, and also details about my students' families that really, for me, informed me about their needs. And so whenever a family would share something with me, I'd always ask and I'd say, hey, I think that piece of information would be very beneficial for the general education teacher. How do you feel about me sharing this part? Most often than not, the families were okay with me sharing it. They trusted me to share it in a dignified, accurate, also, confidential way. And I found that by doing so, I was able to support the teacher while that child was in their general education setting. And we were like a cohesive team. I know that not everybody has the luxury of having administration that knows how to be supportive or has the ability to be supportive or just plainly is supportive. When I started at Crestwood Elementary, my administration was incredibly supportive. I know that if a student was having a difficult time, without any judgment, I could call my principal, and more likely than not, she would drop what she was doing and come help me. And there were some really difficult, sticky situations. You never, as a special ed teacher, you never want to have to restrain a kid. You never want that child to feel emotional or physical lack of safety. And so having another adult to call, to be able to have your back was really important. But again, another relationship that I had to cultivate that we both cultivated, we both built a bridge. And the last thing I wanted to say about collaboration with teachers is find out if you're able to, what flexibility exists in the schedule. I know not all special education teachers are able to build their own schedule, but if you are able to do that, I highly recommend it. I read somewhere, and I'm sorry, I can't credit the author because I don't remember who it is, but they said basically the number one way to increase equity at any school is by taking a hard look at the schedules. And so I know that once I realized this, I talked to my administration about it, and the SPED team actually became part of the team that helped build the schedule. And so every year we help build the schedule to increase equity so that our students with resource minutes wouldn't have to miss any core content instruction, and that the way we built it was to improve all outcomes for all students. So if you have that flexibility, I highly, highly encourage it. All right, family collaboration. I think one of the things that I learned the most about family collaboration is that consent is so important. Everything that I do as a special education team or a teacher is part of a design of a team. You have your IEP team, you have your psychologist, your CEF, or the person who's in charge of compliance at your school. You have the family member, often than not, it's the parent, and you have the general education teacher. Sometimes you'll have related services. And what I realized is that even though everybody gets one seat at that table, families, particularly first-generation families, Latino families, families that historically have been somewhat marginalized from our school systems, don't feel that comfortable in these spaces. They can be really nerve-wracking for them. They can feel very judged by the school team. And just the sheer fact of sitting at a table with a bunch of educational professionals, and that person is probably not an educational professional, just how uncomfortable the power dynamics are. And so my number one thing with family collaboration was always to build a partnership with families, now have them understand how much I appreciated their expertise for their children. And that also consent isn't just something that a family member says yes or no. Because more often than not, if a family member perceives themselves as less formally educated than the teacher, then they don't feel like they have the authority to comment on a child's behavior. Sorry, guys, happens in my classroom. The lights will go off if it thinks there's no movement. So I used to have to do that while we were doing virtual teaching, wave my hands up and down and get the light not to turn off. And so true consent is when the families feel welcomed, like they have a warmth perception, and that they actually get to build with the family. So one of the things I ended up doing was spend a lot of time informally with all the families. We started a garden program at my school, and I made sure that the garden club that I ran had the majority of my students were part of this garden club, because it was a great way for me to build relationships with my students, find ways for them to be successful, but also touch base with the families at least once a week in an informal setting where we're not reporting on anything but positive things, and we're just, having that moment just to say hello. And for me, that's how I could tell when a family was uncomfortable. That's when I can tell, oh, I might be pushing this consent thing. And all of this led me to believe that the IEP meeting starts way before the IEP meeting. And so this means that the family is unaware of the type of data I'm collecting, that there's space for the family to put in their own data ahead of time, that I'm explaining and kind of modeling what the IEP meeting will look like, that I'm giving lots of pauses for families to think, and that I'm always saying, hey, we don't have to make any kind of decision today. We want you to be 100% comfortable with this decision. And that's how we arrived at true consent. One of the ways that I was able to do this was by keeping a document that I would take little notes every time a family would tell me little bits and pieces, and I would kind of keep a book of all these data pieces, all these important information. And on the front cover of that book was all of my students, the time that they preferred to be contacted, because a lot of my students' families worked in the hotel industry, and so they weren't allowed to answer their phones while they were on, and so I made sure that I would try to contact them during their time preference or text them if they preferred, etc. And any other information that was really important to the family. I try to keep that steady so that it was always in the front of my mind. I always, when it was a formal engagement with the family, I like to start by sharing strengths. Hey, your child does this and this and this, and it's awesome. Hey, your child has grown so much in their letter name recognition. Hey, I've noticed your child's confidence beaming, because before, when we were in their class, they would be reluctant to raise their hand and share out, and now they're sharing out regularly. And then I'd always ask the families about their goals for their children, right? Sometimes it was about behavior at the home, being able to share a meal and stay at the table while the family was there. Sometimes it was a sports goal. Sometimes it was like an expression goal, right? They wanted the child to be able to use more complete sentences at home. Whatever it was, I made sure that I knew what those goals were so that I was always aligning. That way, I could, one, honor the family, and two, when I asked the family, hey, could you please work on this skill at home too? the families knew that it was a two-way street. For me, this idea of knowing our rights goes so much farther than the IEP meeting and having a child with special education services. I, in Arizona, worked for a long time with a human rights organization, and we would work to fight deportations. And as we did that, we realized all of the ways that people's comfort and consent were taken away, and how fearful so many communities are of signing paperwork that they don't fully understand. And so I made sure that we talked until the family was done talking about their rights as a family, knowing that nothing was going to be done to their child. This was a group presentation. Yeah, absolutely. I'm happy to share that this was a group decision, and then we would move forward together. The last thing about family participation and collaboration is understanding who your students are in terms of their languages, their culture, but also their historical context. An example of this is that when I switched from Crestwood, the community was very much like my community that I grew up in, first generation, working class. When I went to Booker Elementary is on the historic West Side, and it was one of the first schools in CCSD to be desegregated. So before I accepted that position, I did a deep dive of historical oral histories of the West Side. I understood redlining and how it impacted the community. I understood different migration patterns internally in Las Vegas and what that meant for our community. And I wanted to make sure that I had done my homework ahead of time to be able to greet my students with asset mindsets, to be able to understand their families, and prove and show to the community, hey, you all really matter to me, and I'm going to do my work to be able to understand what maybe isn't at the forefront at a school, but is definitely in the undercurrents, right? Okay, emotional and behavior regulation. Notice that I didn't put student in front of this. I have to be honest with you all. I became a much better teacher when I discovered this concept of collective wellness, meaning that we all care about everybody being well and being taken care of. And that meant me learning some strategies to regulate my own emotions and behavior. Special education teachers do really hard work, and our students really have big emotional and behavioral needs. And we need to always kind of be this calm, neutral touch point for our students. But that's a really hard thing to do as a human. And so when my school started teaching growth mindset and mindfulness, I told my students, hey, I don't know a whole lot about this, but we're going to learn together. And oh my goodness, boy, did we learn together. We learned so much together that I, as a human being, am a better human being because I learned how to name the parts of my brain that have to do with my emotion, because I learned how to be proactive in any kind of deregulation of my emotions, meaning that if I was getting frustrated or feeling anxious or feeling upset, sad, whatever it was, I knew what my body felt like ahead of time so that I could take a pause, put in some of these tricks and strategies to be able to ground myself, to be able to move forward. And so I was learning with my students, and it's really about this collective well-being, right? We're all accountable to ourselves to make sure that we're fair and just and kind and contributing to the community of the classroom. And also, we're helping each other do this. And the more we do this together, the easier of a weight it is on our shoulders. So if you haven't gone down this route, I know that this has been very hip and very prevalent during COVID, but I think the brain is a fascinating thing. And I've seen how education has shifted because of our deep dive into how the brain processes emotions. And so if you haven't had the chance, I strongly recommend that you go and you learn about the brain's way of regulating emotions and how we almost sometimes train our brain to thrive in dysregulation. So what does it mean when my brain is regulated? What does it mean when I can, make sure that my prefrontal cortex is calm enough to send the right directives to my amygdala, to my hippocampus, right? And I worked with students with disabilities, and they learned all of this, and they learned it so well. And so I really invite teachers to be a student with their children, with their students, and learn with your community, learn with them. This is how we make sure that this kind of work is culturally responsive. Sometimes you can't just, use resilience to will yourself out of a really difficult situation, right? It takes a whole lot of more elements. And so in watching my students learn about emotional regulation, I learned how to adjust it so that it was more appropriate to who they were, to their identities. I had a bunch of tricks and tools, a bunch of strategies, a bunch of things so that not one thing had to work for everybody, right? And I watched my students really carefully, and I got their input. I would ask them after that, they would tell me what things really upset them, what things made them really happy, and we would scale all sorts of things. And I would watch my students and get their input when I would do, for example, calm down corners before they even had a name, or sensory corners, or earning motivation and tokens to earn extra, like whatever worked for my students. They knew that they had the right to tell me, and that they knew that they had the right to shift. Hey, Miss Earth, before I used to want to work for free time. Now, if I'm upset, I think I just want to go into the calm down corner. And you would be surprised the agency and autonomy of my students and their language development while we were doing this. I spoke about collective wellness and community, and I think that this shifts kind of this top-down power structure that we have between teachers and students, and it makes it horizontal. If everybody's in charge of everybody's collective wellness and everybody's accountable to themselves and to the community in a non-punitive way, then we're all moving forward. In case you're wondering, hey, how do I do this with my students? How do I do this with my children? How do I do this with myself? I think that the first thing is not everybody knows how to name emotions, and everybody interprets emotions a little bit different. And emotions are complicated and vast, right? And so I think having collective naming and vocabulary for this is really important. And also identifying when we're starting to feel these things. For example, when I get really upset, my cheeks get really hot. When I get nervous, I feel like my throat's starting to constrict, right? And so my students would understand how they felt. Maybe anger for them was first like a pit in their stomach that felt like a stomach ache, right? And so they would identify this, and then I would coach them through some metacognitive skills about, okay, my stomach hurt. What does that mean? Oh, it could mean that I'm upset. Why am I upset? This kind of questioning, self-questioning was really important for my students, and we would model this all the time. And again, as you go down this path, really collaborate with the families and the colleagues that you have at your reach, because it's huge in terms of making sure that our students have the ability to do so. This is a comic I wanted to share with you all. This is from one of my students, Joseph. He's A-okay with everybody knowing that this is his artwork and that this was his goal. He's a twice exceptional child. He is very gifted intellectually and also has autism. And he really struggled with making connections with his peers and with making decisions in the moment. So he loved comics. So we made a comic book, and all the scenarios were pretty real. They had been based off of actual experiences that really were overwhelming for Joseph. And what we would do is he would get to draw a comic, and I would enlist him to go through this metacognitive process as he's drawing the comic. So if you see in that middle box, so let me read it in case you can't see it. The first box says, maybe I should reread, because you can see in his face, he's quite frustrated with the test question because he's taking a test that's really challenging. As a intellectually gifted child, he doesn't like not knowing stuff. And so the next box says, what's the question talking about? See, that's him pausing himself and asking himself a question. Then the next box, you see a shift in his emotion in his face. And it says, I should, ... He's giving himself a pause and time to think. I should match the numbers, something like that. He's trying to figure out what's 9 times 10. And then you see his little tongue coming out in the next box where he's thinking about it. He's giving himself the time to process. And then he solved this problem. What I want you to do is I want you to look at his face in the first box and then his face in the last box, right? Our job isn't to prevent students from feeling emotions or feeling big emotions or overwhelming emotions. We have to prepare them for the real world, right? Especially students with learning and thinking differences. Our job is to help guide them through a process where they can independently go through what they need to go through to be able to come out on the other side with collective wellness, meaning they did not hurt themselves or anybody else, that they were good to themselves and caring and reassuring to themselves. Academic skills. I've learned, because I've taught all the way up to high school, I've learned that no matter what the age is, there is a way to meet students where they are in an age-appropriate way. And so I know that we don't have a whole lot of classroom teachers in here, so I'll just go through these quickly, but we will share the slides out. Basic skills. I like to repeat format and slowly weave in new instruction and spiral old instruction that moved at my students' pace. So most of my classes started with 10 minutes of at your pace instruction. So my students had binders and work that went at their pace. Depending who needed more support, I would spend time with them and kind of bounce around. Reading skills. No matter where a student is, if we want to improve their reading skill, no matter what their age level is, we have to give them the tools. So if a student doesn't know what a vowel is, we have to teach them what a vowel is. If a student doesn't know their letter names and sounds, or maybe is missing a couple, this happened all the time in 5th grade. I'd get students who are new to me and they didn't know maybe 5 or 6 of the letters of the alphabet, but they had been able to kind of hide and go with it. They would never grow in their reading if we didn't stop and address those instructional needs. So if you needed to find age-appropriate texts, there's a whole bunch out there. There's a text that can range the Lexile level, and all the kids get the same article, but they get it in different variations. High Noon Books does children's and young adults comic books and chapter books that are age appropriate, but the content is guided instruction. So it's out there, but we have to meet the students' needs. We have to find ways to find alternatives to memorization. Most students with special needs kind of shut down when they're told to memorize something. And it may work for the majority of the population, but it doesn't work for our students. So make sure that we're providing checklists and breakdowns of tasks and teaching students how to do that for themselves. I love anything and everything multisensory. It is so important for students to have multisensory ways of learning, particularly if they're thinking and learning different. And I have found that it's great for students with ADD and ADHD to always learn in using a couple different other senses because it helps them process information. And my favorite 2 things in my classroom besides the kids are metacognition, because I get to see what they're thinking and they get to build their language as we use metacognition, so that thinking about our thinking, and discourse, particularly for students who are in high areas of linguistically diverse or ELLs. It is so important for them to have so much room to talk. As a teacher, when I was doing my national board, I realized how much talking I did and not enough of my students talking. So that helped me switch the gears. And I learned to listen to my students, and the results were just beyond amazing. And so we have to remember that all the tasks that we do have to humanize our students. It has to bring joy to their learning. It has to be all about collaboration and real world collaboration. And the way we do this is by knowing our students' strengths. So my students love the garden that we built. And so we got to put in a monarch garden, and that monarch garden gave us little larvae every year. And those students in that picture were unable to write a complete sentence at the beginning of the year. This picture was taken probably October, end of October. And you can see how much they had to say about how they took care of this monarch butterfly. And I always got to have them send their work to their families and read their most proud work out loud. Families would draw pictures or write responses. And then after they did that, boom, we would put it on the wall. If a student didn't have a family that was able to do that, they would get to take it to their favorite teacher on campus. That teacher would write all over and boom, it would go on the wall. And so it was just a way to always incorporate our students' identities into their work. And so I'm going to circle back around to this concept. Every child deserves an education that guarantees safety to learn in the comfort of their own skin. And that's not just for kids of color. That's not just for linguistically gifted students. That's also for students with learning and thinking differences. I did a fellowship with Understood. And what I took away from my fellowship is that we have to create a world that invites, celebrates, and is built for difference, right? We can't expect our students to change to be included. We want them to be included exactly as they are today, with all their imperfections and all their goals, but they have that right. And so as a teacher, it is incredibly important to me to build these structures with you all. If you scan that QR code, you'll have a link to all of my contacts, and I would love to stay connected. I know we're going to do a little Q&A here, but if something pops up later, please know that you are more than welcome to reach out. Thank you again for your time. I know it was a kind of like a drive-by session, but again, this is a conversation that I would love to keep going. Thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful evening.